Hi, Founder fans. Jason here. Welcome to our week in review on Sunday this week. The week in review where I will discuss the last 7 founders from Founder of the Day, both on this YouTube channel and on my website, founderoftheday.com, where I publish daily articles about the American Revolution. Usually this is done on Thursday, but I was unfortunately out of town on Thursday, so this is a makeup session. But that's okay because we have a ton of fun American founders to talk about this week. People rolling in a little slowly today. That's all right. It's Sunday afternoon. I kind of surprised you with it. Let's start off real quick here. Let's get right into the federal farmer. So I've been publishing anti-federalist articles or reviewing anti-federalist papers every Friday, starting with get my head together today. I've done a whole bunch of founders, anti-federalist papers. We are up to Federal Farmer number 3. Federal Farmer is one of the more fun anti-federalist papers I've covered, and we are looking at Federal Farmer number 3 today, where the Federal Farmer, who, again, we don't know who it was for sure, but it was probably Melancton Smith of New York, he used the Constitution itself to discuss the flaws of the United States Constitution. So, very notably, he starts off by attacking the idea that exactly how this many people in the House of Representatives and United States Senate are supposed to represent, quote, the opinions of 3 or 4 million people. So, essentially, what he says is the House of Representatives, when the United States government was formed, only needed 33 people there to form a quorum. And because of this, only 2/3 of that quorum could pass any laws. So why would 17 people be able to represent the opinions of 3 or 4 million people? This is the heart of this beginning argument. He also says that Congress can decide where elections can take place, and since this is before the Bill of Rights, Congress could literally say every election is taking place in Georgia. Have fun. And then no one would be able to vote back then when there was no internet or cars or planes. No one's taking a horse from New Hampshire or New York or even Virginia to Georgia just to vote. Additionally, he says doesn't matter anyway because most people are going to vote for local candidates that they knew. And most people lived in farms in small rural communities. So they would vote for someone they knew. And that person would not have a chance next to anyone living in a big city because big cities had more people just around and therefore more connections to those local politicians. In this situation, people from big cities would continuously be elected to represent everyone. And furthermore, that would consolidate the finances and the powers of the wealthy elite more and more and more and more. He then goes on to criticize the Senate itself, saying that he actually uses the Constitutional Convention as proof that the United States was too big to assume into one place. He talks about the compromise, which we usually call the Connecticut Compromise, also known as the Great Compromise, where they famously came together and said, okay, we'll have elections by population for the House of Representatives and elections equal representation in the United States Senate. And he points out that this was a compromise with small states who didn't want big states to have too much power. But that means that despite not having the population or wealth as bigger states, smaller states like Rhode Island and Delaware, and at the time Georgia, would have a disproportionate amount of power for their population and wealth compared to a place like Virginia or New York. He implies that this is inherently unfair. Why would one person's vote in a smaller state count more than a person's vote in a bigger state? This issue still does arise. I mean, again, we're not going to get into modern politics today, but nowadays, you look at the votes of Utah. Someone who lives in Utah, one vote from a person who lives in Utah carries the weight of 3 votes of someone who lives in Connecticut. Now, whether or not you agree with the politics of those 2 states, the greater point is that why would the citizens of Utah, why would their vote count more? We should all be represented equally under the government. And this great compromise that we usually refer to at the Constitutional Convention, Federal Farmer points out, no, this is not a great compromise. This is inherently unequal, and just the idea that we need to make compromises of this nature to get the government started proves that this government will not work and will not be equal to the people at large. Unfortunately for him, the Constitution does obviously pass, but it is one of those really important early points that many of the Anti-Federalists really wanted to stick to. They were really unhappy about that particular idea. Again, the fear at the time, many of the founders pointed at Montesquieu, a writer who wrote about essentially a century earlier, whose discussions were that a republic can only work in a smaller place. The reason one of their contemporaries, such as the Netherlands, was able to have a republic, it was smaller, there was less people, they were closer together, they could make it happen. But being this large, this spread out with this many people, to many American founders seemed quite near impossible to have a free government, as they called it, a republic that could work successfully. And again, it was this compromise, the Constitutional Convention, that itself seemed to many of the founders, Federal Farmer included, that we just could not make this happen without compromises. That's not to say that compromise is bad. They didn't like compromise. Obviously, to keep the mechanisms of an economy running, a government needs to make compromises between disagreeing parties. However, when you have such vast people with such wide disagreements, that these compromises, as the one at the Constitutional Convention, would have to be so great that it would limit the liberties of a gigantic portion of the population, not just a smaller, outvoted segment of it. Again, these federal farmers are very long, especially the first handful, but he continues on to talk about taxes and the army. He points out that only a handful of people will actually be appointed to the government. I have a quote here that he says, quote, "The power of making any law will be in the president, 8 senators, and 17 representatives." Again, this is because there were only 13 states. So you have 26 people in the United States Senate. Half of a quorum would be 2/3 of that. And then to have a majority vote of the quorum, you will only need 8 senators. And the same thing goes to the House of Representatives. House, of course, had a larger number of people, but you would only need 17 of them. So that essentially means, if I'm counting right, 26 total people could make any law that was necessary and proper to carry out taxation and support the government. Additionally, those 26 people, although really just the president, had control of the military to enforce these laws. He also goes on to point out that the Constitution does say that the state militias, which are essentially armies of the people to protect themselves, could be commandeered by the federal government to enforce federal laws. He also points out, and I thought this was absolutely fascinating, that there was no discussion of posse comitatus, which is a posse, which, yeah, I know sounds like the Old West, and that is what he means, calling out the posse. Because at the time, all of the laws, the police forcing, was done by a sheriff, who would go out and call out the posse. Now, the posse was local people who could be deputized to assist the sheriff. These people were usually part of the state militia also. That's why they would be good choices to come be deputized. That being said, if the federal government is calling in the state militia, then who could the sheriff call out as a posse to enforce local laws? No one. Additionally, shouldn't that just be put in the Constitution that the local sheriffs did have these powers in their county? Again, further removing power from the individuals and the people and the county and the local community and handing that power over to the federal government. Finally, he goes into justice at the time. We've discussed the judicial system as it's outlined in the Constitution, many of the criticisms there. He does bring up, in this long essay, the Federal Farmer does bring up many of the common arguments about the judicial system, but he specifically focuses on the moving great distances for trial. Again, just like elections, there was no Bill of Rights yet telling people they could have a local trial. And again, they could be brought to another state entirely. They could be brought anywhere for trial, or at least commanded to go somewhere for trial. Now, the federal farmer does not want frivolous lawsuits, and he thinks there should be a little bit of difficulty in filing a suit and suing people. That being said, people should have the opportunity to do it. And a lot of this whole, like, going to other states for trial smacked very heavily of Great Britain just before the Revolution, saying that citizens had to get on a boat and sail to England to have a trial, which was, not convenient, especially for regular people who didn't have the money to not only get a lawyer, but to travel these distances and everything of that nature. So, his estimation that he also, I should note, in most other nations and most states, there were different types of courts to handle different types of suits. Even in New York, for example, you have Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, but you also had Chancellor, for a long time, Robert Livingston, who was Chancellor, and these handled different types of suits. Personal suits, courts of common pleas, business issues, just criminal cases. These were all handled by different court systems entirely. And this is a major complaint of the United States Constitution, is why does this Supreme Court handle all cases? And why don't we, like the states already have or other nations have, why don't we have several sets of courts to handle their individual types of decisions? So that way the justices at the highest levels of government could have specialized in a certain type of law that they were now overseeing, expecting these supreme justices on the Supreme Court to know everything about all law, while most of them assuredly had a background in most law. They did not necessarily have a complete understanding of all law, which, as we understand, can be very complicated even back then. And again, this is I like this argument. It's very often overlooked. I almost looked right past it today. It's very overlooked when discussing the American Revolution, discussing the United States Constitution and the Supreme Court. How, nowadays we just see the one Supreme Court. It's almost natural. But at the time, no, there were lots of different courts, systems. Why do we only have one here? And that's an argument you don't even hear very often in the Anti-Federalist papers. So hope you enjoyed that. Anyone hanging out, if you have any questions, I'm here for it. Again, this is a makeup video. I apologize for being out of town this week, but we went to learn about science in Ithaca, Kids Science Museum. It was fun. Now, we're going to head over to David Bushnell. Now that we got the nitty-gritty Anti-Federalist out of the way, let's have some fun. David Bushnell is the inventor of the first working submarine, but his story is fascinating. First of all, he was a simple farmer who was working on his dad's land when his father passed away, and he and his brother Ezra both inherited property from their father. Now, David Bushnell was very, very smart, and he wanted to go to college. He wanted to get a further education. So what he did is his brother and he both inherited half the family land. Bushnell sold his half to his younger brother and used that money to pay for classes at Yale. Now, what's interesting, this is a point in time where most people graduating college were graduating by like 20 years old, even younger most of the time. Bushnell was already 31 when he starts at Yale, and he gets this title, lovingly, I would assume, he's called the Old Man by his fellow students. Now, I'm significantly older than 31 at this point, and I don't like the idea of him being called the Old Man, but I definitely understand how these people in their late teens would attest to him. He was almost double their age, so I can understand that. That being said, this old man receives his degree in 1775, which is just after the American Revolutionary War broke out up in Boston. Now, many of his contemporary students went to become officers to make their name at war. Bushnell at this point did not join the war effort in that fashion. Instead, he decides to join the war in his own little way by making weapons. What fun. He invents, first of all, before we get to the submarine, he invents an explosive device that can detonate while it's underwater. This had been tried many times, but he's the first person to successfully create, essentially, a mine that could explode in the water. But how are you going to get this onto the ships that you want to detonate? So, David Bushnell then invents the submarine not because he wanted to invent the submarine, but because he needed to find a way to get his new explosive device onto ships, specifically British enemy ships. So he invents the submarine out of necessity, as most inventions seem to develop. He wants some help. He needs someone to pilot this ship. He's not going to. I'm not going under the water. You do it. He gets his brother Ezra to come help. Which, interestingly, his brother Ezra was serving under Nathan Hale, who actually Nathan Hale goes on to famously be the first American spy who gets hung pretty much right away. Doesn't do such a great job of it. Sorry, Nathan Hale fans. He's only a spy for 2 weeks before he's caught and executed. So not the best spying. The Culper Ring would do a better job because they learned from Hale's mistakes. But the point is, back when Hale was still alive, Ezra Bushnell was serving under him. David talks to his old friend Hale, who he went to college with, Hale being one of the people who called David Bushnell the old man, as did Benjamin Talmadge, who goes on to be a very good spy master himself, two of his David Bushnell's college friends, younger friends. So they go. Ezra is given permission by Nathan Hale to come help his brother David. They train for a while. Unfortunately, Ezra gets sick, so they need to find someone else. And they talk to, I believe it was Parsons. The name escapes me. Another Brigadier General, Samuel Holden Parsons, I believe, is the person they spoke to. Parsons gives 3 men go to train with Ezra and Bushnell to learn how to pilot this submarine. And it's kind of like what you see with astronauts. Especially when the first astronauts were going to space, they got a whole bunch of people, like 20 people to train to be astronauts, and then they chose the best 3 to go to the moon for the first time, for example, out of the whole crew. And that's what they do here. They train these people for a month, and the one that stands out is another man named Ezra Lee. And we are going to talk about Ezra Lee right after we finish about Bushnell. So, very brief. Ezra Lee trains, gets in, pilots the submarine, which they called the Turtle, because not only did it go down underwater and back up like a turtle, but it had a shell and kind of looked like a weird turtle. So they called it that. Ezra does go and attempt to detonate it and comes back. Now, again, we are going to talk about Ezra Lee after we finish Bushnell, so I'm going to save that story for a minute. That being said, they return. It kind of fails. Bushnell, they then do a second piloting of this. Again, fails, and then it works as a submarine. It goes below water, comes back up. I'm going to get all into that into the next story, but the 2 times they attempt to use it, it doesn't really work. Anyway, eventually the Turtle, as it's called, is put on a boat, and the British, it's hard to tell if they see a ship with the Turtle on it, or if they just sink a ship and the Turtle has to be on it, but they do sink the ship. They sink, and with it, the Turtle was being stored on it, so the Turtle also sinks. Now, David Bushnell does later actually claim that he's dug up the bones of it or gotten it out of the water. I don't know how, because there wasn't a second one, so how did he submerge? I don't know. There's a lot about Bushnell's later life that's a little questionable, so we'll get to that in a second. But I do want to note, Bushnell is then really applauded by George Washington himself and actually given a position in the Continental Army. He becomes the commander or captain of the Corps of Sappers and Miners. Sappers and miners are technically still around. Sappers, to my understanding, have they deal with explosives, usually setting up defenses from explosives and monitoring explosives in the field. And miners are very similar. They make sure we're not stepping on any landmines nowadays and things of that nature, and planting landmines. Although I'm not sure they still do that anymore. But the sappers and miners essentially dealt with explosives, not artillery. That was Henry Knox, but explosives themselves. It was a smaller group, but they had several interesting run-ins. Outside Philadelphia, they did something that came to be known as the Battle of the Kegs. Though it's hard to be called a battle because there's no battle going on. What they did is they got a bunch of kegs and filled them with explosives, put them in the river, the Delaware River, sent them down at the British ships parked south of, just outside of Philadelphia. Now, this didn't work because the British ships in the wintertime had parked in a fashion that would make it so that icebergs floating down the river didn't destroy their ships. And therefore, these barrels of explosives also did not hit any ships, just as the icebergs did not do. And when I say icebergs, they weren't like Titanic sinking icebergs, but just chunks of ice, but big enough to, really damage a ship. They send these down. It misses all the ships. Sadly, there are two little boys who see, whoa, what is that thing? Let's go touch it. And then that doesn't end well for those guys. So they're the only victims of these explosives were these children. So again, making it very difficult to call it a battle, but it is known as Battle of the Kegs, mostly because, and you know what, I had it somewhere. Francis Hopkinson, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, a gentleman who helped design the American flag, design the Great Seal of America, really the artist of the American founding. He actually ends up writing a poem about it later on, which, you know what, at the end of the video, if you guys are still hanging around, I was thinking about reading the poem. I'm not going to do it right in the middle, but at the end, I can read through the poem because it is a lot of fun. Now, Bushnell is with the army through the whole war and goes to the Battle of Yorktown, helping with the sappers and miners at Yorktown. And then he gets weird. After the Revolutionary War, Bushnell goes back to Connecticut for a few years, and then suddenly leaves for France, and then kind of vanishes from the historical record for about 15 years. There's no record of what he does in Europe. And then suddenly, for some reason, he reemerges in Georgia under an assumed name. Eventually, he's found out to be David Bushnell. People are like, where you been, man? And he is a little hush-hush. He ends up teaching school in Georgia, a children's school, for several decades. He's a school teacher. And then passes away, still in Georgia, in his 80s. So he lives a nice, long, healthy life. And that is the weird end of David Bushnell. Now, I will note, there are two submarines, one from World War I and one from World War II, that have both been called the USS Bushnell, are submarines USS, or is that just ships? But they were named in Bushnell's honor. Of that I am certain. So that is the weird, fascinating story of David Bushnell, the father of the submarine. Just a really, really fun character from the Revolutionary War. And with that, if you have any questions, Crypto Camels, thank you so much. Thanks for watching. I appreciate your compliment there. But with that, we are going to move on to Ezra Lee, who, as I said, was the gentleman who actually pilots David Bushnell's first submarine. Let me take a quick sip of water. And yes, I'm seeing it was Samuel Holden Parsons that recommended Ezra Lee. So we have kind of set up Ezra Lee's story here a little bit. Now, most of his early life is undocumented. He seems to marry up into wealth because he marries into Samuel Holden Parsons' family. He's actually brother-in-law with Brigadier General Samuel Holden Parsons, and that's why he's recommended to join. He had served in the Continental Army as a sergeant. He's chosen to go out and sink a ship with an underwater bomb that has a submarine built for its operation. So, real quick, let's talk about the operation of the Turtle. So, this contraption was probably smaller than this little corner I'm in. You moved it using foot cranks and hand cranks, foot pedals like a bike and hand cranks like this. It had a breathing tube, what is it called, a snorkel out the top that could be closed up and sealed tight so water didn't get in. So you would go up top, but once you closed the snorkel, you only had half an hour's worth of breathing. And then what you do is you'd move gears to take on water to have it sink, and then you'd have to push the water out to have it resurface. So this is the scenario that Ezra Lee finds himself in, plopped in this little machine. They bring it out into New York Harbor, put it in the water. They say, go put this bomb out. So he paddles for like 2 hours of strenuous paddling, submerges, and goes out below the boat. Now, the boat he's attacking is the HMS Eagle. It is the flagship of, I have your General Howe. I don't believe it might have been Admiral Howe. It might have been his brother. There are the two Howe brothers, but it's the flagship of the British Navy in the American harbor. Now, he goes up to the bottom of it in his little turtle, and what he needs to do is he's in a boat underwater with a bomb on the outside and a screw on the top, and he's supposed to screw into the ship, release the bomb, and set its timer, because it was a time bomb. Also, There had been time bombs before, but again, this is the first underwater explosive, so the first underwater time bomb. So he is like bumping into the bottom of the Eagle, trying to screw this in with a bomb between his ship and the ship he's trying to attack. He does screw in a little bit, but he can't get it to screw into the ship. Now, there have been a lot of discussions. For a long time, it was believed that this was because the bottom of the ship had metal on it, and he couldn't screw through the type of metal on the bottom of the ship. The historians seem to have disproved this. It seemed to either have been that he was actually hitting another screw in the ship, like a metal screw that was, not flat, like a whole screw. He kept hitting it, or because he was moving too much underwater. You see, where the Eagle was not only where the East River and the Hudson Rivers met below Manhattan, but also where the Atlantic Ocean came in. So they tried to time it right with the tides, but he was getting hit in 3 directions, and it was very difficult to stay sturdy enough to screw directly into the ship. That being said, he tries and tries. Eventually, he has to give up because his half an hour of air is running out, so he goes very quickly back to the surface. And this is when a bunch of sailors on the Eagle see something strange pop out of the water. Now, I'll remind you, this is the first submarine ever, so no one had ever seen one, especially these sailors on the ship. They're like, what is that? So they decide to chase it. So they go down in their rafts and start chasing it, and Ezra Lee is paddling. Again, he's already been paddling for upwards of 2 hours at this point. He's probably exhausted, and he sees them coming. And I will allow Ezra Lee to explain what happens next in his own words. Quote, "I eyed them, and when they got within 50 or 60 yards of me, I let loose the magazine in the hopes that if they should take me, they would likewise pick up the magazine, and then we should all be blown up together." So just to clarify his old-timey English, he sees them coming, he assumes he's getting caught, so he lets the time bomb go, assuming that they would get him and see the time bomb, pick them both up, and he, with his captors, would explode. He was literally prepared to sacrifice his own life. Lucky for him and the sailors who were chasing him, seeing the submarine come up was very, very strange. A contraption they had never seen in the water before, and it was one thing to chase that. But when that contraption sent out another piece at them, that was too much, and they backed off. And that's fortunate for everyone, because that explodes a few seconds later, sending water sky high, and the British scurrying off, and giving Ezra Lee the opportunity to escape. And he does escape, and tells his story. Now, just like David Bushnell before him, at the same time, Ezra Lee is also commended highly by General Washington. This is a fascinating, essentially espionage mission, being sent in under the water, paddling for hours, evading capture. It is a tale of heroics that impresses the commander-in-chief, and he gives Lee several positions throughout the Continental Army, and for a while, he's actually sent out on intelligence gathering missions as part of Washington's large network of spies and other intelligence gathering. I wouldn't call him a spy. He doesn't really go in and spy. He just goes out and scouts and finds intelligence. And I love this fact that General Washington notes that Ezra Lee's correspondence is extremely clear. Apparently, Washington is a little tired of getting half informations and sloppy written materials, and Ezra Lee has great penmanship and is very specific and to the point with his details, and Washington specifically notes that, which I thought was hilarious. And he spends the rest of the war fighting with the army before retiring to his farm in Connecticut, and he dies about 40 years after the Revolutionary War. And when he dies, there's a great obituary that it says, I don't have the quote in front of me, but something along the lines of, he was the only American to fight the British on land, on sea, and under the sea. So Ezra Lee under the sea, as I like to say. What a fascinating character. If you guys have any questions, that's what these week wrap-ups are good for. I also talk a little bit more slowly and deliberately. And I do sip my water from time to time because I'm talking a lot. So we are going to talk about Clement Biddle, the forage master of the Continental Army. Clement Biddle is part of the huge Biddle family, and I gotta give another shout out to Janet Hicks, who's one of the big supporters of this channel, who is a descendant of the Biddles and sends me a whole bunch of information about the family all the time. Thank you, Janet, and helps me learn some of these stories, so certain things I might not have stumbled on, which we will get into in a second, actually. But when the war breaks out, the Biddle family joins the war. They're a wealthy Philadelphia family, mostly of merchants. One of those families that so many people participate in smaller, or even as Clement, higher levels of the Continental Army and fighting in the war, though they're overlooked because there's too many of them, kind of. It's like the Morris family in New York did so much for the war in all sorts of fashions, but there's not just one sexy name that stands out. There's a bunch of mildly attractive names that kind of fall in the mix, and that's what makes the Biddle family a whole lot of fun. Clement, for his part, he joins the Revolutionary War right away, and he's appointed as a colonel and is a deputy quartermaster general. So he starts serving under the quartermaster, trying to help supply the army. Now, he really starts to stand out after the battles of Princeton and Trenton, when a bunch of German soldiers have been taken captive, and Washington decides to move these soldiers to western Pennsylvania, where there's a big German population, so they could be more comfortable, maybe decide to fight with the Continentals instead for a little more money because they were mercenaries and they were, soldiers for hire. Maybe they would just, start living in society. They'd probably be less of a flight risk because they were staying with other Germans. Clement Biddle is actually charged with moving these soldiers to western Pennsylvania. Now, he doesn't oversee the operation. He doesn't move them himself. He delegates that tasks thank you, Walker, that's really nice of you to say. He delegates those tasks to other soldiers to move over. Hi, TJ, thank you for coming. If you guys have any questions, I'm here. Let me know. We're just wrapping up the last week again. I'm sorry it's a few days late. I was out of town on Thursday. We'll be back to Thursdays this week. But either way, Biddle moves. He oversees the task of moving these soldiers out there. He also follows the army into Valley Forge. And this is where he makes his life, but I do want to transition, and I did forget to bring up a copy of the map, but this is what Janet helped me learn about. Clement's cousin was a grandson of a gentleman named Nicholas Skull, and Nicholas Skull was a surveyor and mapmaker in the mid-1700s, especially in Pennsylvania, and he has a famous, really important map of early Philadelphia. And Biddle actually contacts his cousin to get his grandfather's map. It's not the actual map. I forget the name of it, but the plates to print new copies of the map, because they're in Valley Forge. They're just outside Philadelphia. They want a good map of all the surrounding areas so they can disrupt enemy movements. They can forage for food, which is about to become important, as you see his title. They can encamp better, they can defend better. It's just obvious, for many obvious reasons. Strategically, it's good to have an accurate map. So he does get this map, the Skull map, as it was already known at the time, to help George Washington and the army. He ends up really impressing George Washington, and it's at Valley Forge that he is named Commissary General of Forage, or Deputy Commissary General of Forage. There was already a Commissary General. Of course, there were deputies that did different things. Now, as Deputy Commissary General of Forage, he was generally called FORAGEMASTER General, because that's just easier to say and more accurate. Now, when we think of forage, nowadays, it's like you go in the forest and you forage for some food. No, forage generally referred to things that were grown on farms that were grains primarily, wheat, and the rice was further south in Pennsylvania, so he wasn't really dealing in rice, but all sorts of grains that you could help feed the army. Although it did at times extend to any food that you could get for the army. Now, while Valley Forge was going on, it famously is a starving time. There were the times that try men's souls, as Thomas Paine famously put it. So Clement Biddle, you can look at him and say, hey, he's the one who wasn't getting any food for the Continental Army. But the truth is, supply chains were already tough at this point. the river froze over, the roads were hard to freeze, and there wasn't a lot of food. In fact, Clement Biddle was really the only person who got the Continental Army any food. And a side note, it does seem like one of the reasons Washington would later want a national government is because the Continental Congress was not working, was not able to get food to this army because they weren't able to get a quorum of people. They weren't able to work as a unified body. But that's a side note. Clement Biddle, for his part, is the one getting any food. Now, through the second half, or really the winter of 1778, I'll remind you, winter starts Christmas Day, not when it starts snowing. It's already winter by then. Not Christmas Day, 2 or 3 days before Christmas. But winter really starts in January, February, March. And at that time in New Jersey is the forage wars going on. Mostly fought with the militia, the New Jersey militia, though the Continental Army did participate to a large degree. And these were wars around New York City, mostly in New Jersey, to take food from local farmers, because these farmers had food and you needed food to feed the army. I will note George Washington really went out of his way to only take what they needed and leave each farmer enough food to pay for his farm for the following year. He didn't want to bankrupt anybody. He wanted these people to support the American cause. And that's one of the main things he did. That's one of the reasons Clement Biddle actually writes at one point saying, can we take a little more then? Because we don't have anything. So the forage wars are going on, and essentially whenever the Americans and Patriots won one of these wars, Clement Biddle was the one who would go out with wagons to get that food and get it back to Valley Forge and help these soldiers not starve to death. And the fact that all of the soldiers didn't starve to death, a lot of that actually falls to Clement Biddle, making him an extraordinarily underrated person who, honestly, I didn't really know enough about until I started researching this article, until Janet had sent that the article to me about the skull map is what I was researching. Oh, cool, the map. And then I realized, as I read, I'm like, wow, this guy was really in the heart of feeding the army at Valley Forge. Again, we always think of Valley Forge as like the time to try men's souls, the starving time. But some people were desperately trying to feed those soldiers. And Clement Biddle was at the top of that list of people trying to feed the Continental Army. Now, he stays for I believe most of the war. Yeah, he stays through the remainder of the war as FORAGEMASTER General, though foraging becomes... It's always important. It's always important to feed the army, but Continental Congress does kind of get its act together, and the Commissary General and the Quartermaster General become more able to actually feed these soldiers in future winters and summers. Though, again, there's always forage. He's always in the mix of trying to, lower prices, because a major problem with Valley Forge that I left out was that farmers were like, oh, you want to buy food, huh? Okay, we're going to raise our prices. And that was troublesome. And I should note, too, it was on Biddle's request that Washington sent out a fairly famous letter to local states saying, hey, the Continental Congress isn't giving us food. Like, you don't have to give us food, but please give us food. Like, we are all in this together. We really need your help. And that met with middling degrees of success, depending on the different states. But again, that was inspired by Biddle really telling Washington, like, we're running out of options here. Like, there's only so much food I can forage. So, do something. I will note, he ends up going on... Biddle has a long relationship with George Washington, especially after the war. Before the war, he was already buying things for Washington as an agent. Again, he was from a merchant family. Philadelphia was the big city in North America, and Washington in Mount Vernon, out by Alexandria, wasn't the big city. So if he wanted some rich people fun things, he would have to reach out to his agent, who was Biddle. And especially after the war, Biddle just buys tons of things for Washington, takes a little cut off the top, sends it over. And it's great. He then goes on to get appointed by the first president, George Washington, as the first U.S. Marshal for Pennsylvania. Right when they create the federal government, they start creating U.S. Marshals, which is essentially a sheriff for the whole state there to enforce the federal laws. Again, as we discussed earlier with Federal Farmer number 3, he would have been able to call out the state militia to enforce federal laws, though the county sheriffs, there was no provision to call out the posse. And he remains in that for several years before returning to his very wealthy lifestyle as a merchant in Philadelphia. So that's the FORAGEMASTER General of the Continental Army. Clement Biddle. Just one of those. I love the title FORAGEMASTER General. It's one of the more badass titles in the Continental Army, if you ask me. Walker, that's really nice of you. Thank you so much. I do appreciate you guys watching. That's why I keep doing it. You keep watching. I'm going to take a sip of... You have a town named Mount Vernon in Washington. It makes a lot of sense that Washington State would have a town named Mount Vernon. There's a town in Mount Vernon named New York. There's a town in New York named Mount Vernon also, although I don't live very close to it anymore. You're about to get a hockey team this week, Seattle. In case you're interested in what sports I watch when I'm not doing history, it is hockey. We're going to bounce over here to Edward Telfair. So Edward Telfair, a name oft forgot, though still fairly important. Telfair was actually born in Scotland, and moves around for a while in his early life before ending up in Savannah, Georgia, where he established himself, starts a merchant firm in Georgia, which, as a reminder, Georgia was only founded in 1735. So 1775, colony's only 40 years old. And it's literally the children of the people who's, yes, TJ the Kraken, they're coming. It's literally only, it's the children of many of the founders of Georgia, although much of Georgia, some of them are the founders themselves. Some people came over in their 20s and 30s. Now they're in their 60s and 70s, still alive, the founders of Georgia. So he moved there in the 1760s, where the colony is only 30 years old, and there's a lot of opportunity there. That's why you see Georgia being frequented, not only a lot of immigrants from other places in the world, but you see a big collections of like New Englanders, Yankees coming down, carpetbaggers kind of, coming down to like establish little cliques of society in Georgia. In fact, that's one of the reasons when the war breaks out in Georgia, when the war breaks out in general, people of Georgia are largely divided because most of Georgia is empty and needs the protection of the king for the Native American nations around there. But there are these parishes, as they called counties down there, that got together that were almost entirely made up of people from Connecticut, for example, and they were very much tied to the other people from Connecticut. Got a little off track there. Telfair goes down there. He makes a name for himself with his merchant firm. As the revolution's coming, he joins the Committee of Safety, and when the war starts, he becomes a member of the Provincial Assembly. One of, I usually call them the shadow governments of the different colonies between the outbreak of the war and the creation of the states. Although Georgia kind of has several governments going on all at once, and he becomes a member of one of those governments. He ends up getting sent to the Continental Congress after independence is declared, and Telfair is there for the better part of 5 years, during which time he signs the Articles of Confederation. One of the probably the second most noteworthy thing in his life. The most noteworthy being when he becomes governor of Georgia. But before we get there, there's one really fun story that I came across when I was researching Edward Telfair. They had ambassadors overseas. Your John Adams, your Benjamin Franklins are overseas. They should probably get paid or at least reimbursed for their money. Now, by May of 1782, they are already, the hostilities are pretty much over. And they're debating, how do we end this war? What does the peace treaty look like? And they decide, you know what we need to do? We need to establish a commissioner to oversee the finances of our foreign diplomats. Because it's not just France and England and Spain who are getting diplomats. I mean, you have Ralph Izard going to Tuscany, which, because there wasn't in Italy, there were palpable states. So there were separate nations that Italy considered itself. Same thing with Germany. You have Francis Dana going to Russia, meeting Catherine the Great, who doesn't recognize him because she doesn't want to get in a war with England. And they start the League of Armed Neutrality, which is just a bunch of small countries in Europe saying, we'll share, doing what the United States did, essentially saying we're going to share our navies to make sure England doesn't attack any of us. You have people going to Italy, the Joy brothers we're about to discuss. You have people going to China, because where do you think this tea that no one wanted taxes on came from? It was coming from China. So they need to organize the finances of their world relations. And then nothing happens. They decide we're going to have a commissioner, and nothing happens. Until 2 months later, when Edward Telfair, all of a sudden out of nowhere, stands on the floor of Congress and motions, hey, we should pay the commissioner $4,000 a year. which was a good amount of money back then. And everyone goes, what commissioner? Like, remember we were talking about getting a commissioner to oversee our ambassadors? And they were like, oh yeah, okay. So suddenly they jump into action. They walk around, they talk about the issue. They decide to choose Thomas Barclay as the first commissioner to oversee this operation. Barclay himself would go on to play an important discussion in negotiations with North Africa in the coming years. But they don't, it's funny because they forgot to nominate a commissioner. Telfair says, let's pay him this much money. They say, okay, here's the commissioner. And then they don't pay him any money because they want to see how much work, what his workload looks like before they actually pay him. But that's Edward Telfair's place in this weird discussion. I found this story. I wanted to bring it to you because it's silly and important, but I don't know why I associate it with Telfair, just because he's the one who brought up the pay scale, I guess, but that's fun. Anyway, Telfair then is part of the, he goes and attempts to negotiate a treaty with the Native Americans in the South. He wants to end the Cherokee-American War, as it's sometimes called. Now, this proves impossible. He does not actually end this treaty. That would come around later in the Treaty of Hopewell, or Treaties of Hopewell. It's technically 3 treaties between 3 separate nations in the American South. But instead, when that doesn't happen, he represents Georgia in a land dispute with North Carolina. That all gets resolved. Edward, after the war ends, he goes back to Georgia, and he becomes, in 1786, the governor of Georgia, and serves for 3 consecutive terms as governor of Georgia. Now, he is governor during the Yazoo land fraud, and yes, it's called the Yazoo land fraud. I know that sounds fake. There is a Yazoo River in what was then Georgia, and today, I apologize, I think it's in modern-day Mississippi. Off the top of my head, I don't remember. I will remind you, Georgia at the time included Alabama and Mississippi. That was all Georgia. That would soon change, as Georgia couldn't afford to repay many of its war debts. Like many of the states, Georgia would pay its war debts with its inland sales. The Yazoo land fraud does begin under Edward Telfair. It is basically they sell this western land to the federal government or the Confederated government to pay off their war debts, and then they also sell off rights to the land to individuals in Georgia. But since they sold this land to the government, they don't have the right to sell it to people. It's now the government's land to sell to people, because that's how the government's going to pay off, or when I say the government, I mean the Confederation. That's how the Confederation is going to pay off these war debts it has, right? Georgia's argument was, well, Virginia had sold land to its citizens before selling that to the government, to which everyone responded, yeah, they sold land to people and then gave the rights of the land to the government. You gave the land to the government and then sold it to the people. You see how that order's backwards there? That doesn't really work. Now, this was a great debate for about a decade in Georgia. It takes a very long time to resolve until future Governor Jackson, I think it's James Jackson, it might be Jesse Jackson. I apologize, I forget his name. He was a very important soldier in the Revolutionary War, officer. Washington gave him the keys to Savannah, and he would go on to be a senator and a governor. Jackson's a very important person in Georgia. Helps resolve a lot of these issues. But I do bring it up, a lot of the beginnings of this was under Edward Telfair. He should get a shake of the finger for that. He is one of the many politicians in Georgia who made a lot of money off the Yazoo land fraud. And again, it's historically known as the Yazoo land fraud. And I know the Yazoo part sounds silly. The important part is fraud. It is historically known as a fraud. So, sorry, Edward Telly over here. Ed Tell, you did sign the articles, you were governor, not the best there. But I do want to note, and I need to note this. When George Washington was elected the first president, there were 69, I believe, voters. And at the time, you voted twice. You voted once. It wasn't a ticket. It was whoever got the most votes was president, and the second most votes was vice president. So every elector got 2 votes. Not every person, not every voter. Every elector got 2 votes. One for president, one for president. And whoever got the second most, again, would be VP. So when this happened, George Washington got 69 votes. Everyone voted for him once. They also voted a second time. John Adams famously became vice president with 35 votes, if memory serves, about half of what Washington got. But there were a total of 12 people who got votes for president of the United States in that first election. And one of those people, from Georgia, that got one vote to be the first, technically vice president, but no. His vote was for vice president, but technically it was a vote for first president of the United States of America. It was Edward Telfair. It's actually one of 3 people from Georgia who got one vote. It's very strange. I am going to do a video about it in a few weeks after I finish wrapping up the discussions we're having about the delegates to the First Continental Congress. So look forward to that. I'm going to go. I'm very excited. I've been planning for a while to go through the first handful of elections and talk about the people who actually got votes and why. Like and subscribe. And yeah, so that is generally the story of Edward Telfair. So we got 2 more founders to get through. Actually, technically, we got 4 more because I came at you with a 3-parter this week. I'm going to take some water. The Joy Boys, as I've started calling them. The Joy Brothers. I ran into this family. I don't remember where I ran into it. It was with the last one we'll discuss, George Joy. Because he had a lot of back and forth with James Madison. And we'll get into that. But all the brothers were interesting to me. There were more siblings I left out. These are the 3 brothers who really had a kind of a bigger part in creating the founder, or attempting to create the founders. Let's get into it. So what happens is John Joy is from a Massachusetts family, a very wealthy Boston family. He had made a lot of money during the 7 Years' War, aka the French and Indian War, supplying the soldiers for Great Britain during that war, feeding them, clothing them, things of that nature. By 1776, he has begun helping General Gage suppress the people of Boston. See, he made a lot of money helping the British in the 1750s, 1760s. Why wouldn't I keep making money helping the British? They were all British. Why wouldn't I help the Army and Navy by feeding them and clothing them, making even more money now? Well, the reason is because Boston gets seized by the Patriot Army, and the British have to evacuate Boston. So John Joy evacuates Boston. Now, he's not the founder we're talking about. He was a loyalist. He had many children, but 3 of his sons evacuate with him. Now, what's interesting is these gentlemen are already of age. They are younger. The youngest one's 19. I think it was 20 and 22 were their ages. So they absolutely could have said, sorry, Dad, we're going to fight, as happened. The Revolutionary War was a civil war, and children did disagree with their parents and fight on the other side. Not the Joy Boys. The Joy Boys go with their dad back. They go to New York and Halifax and end up in London. And they spend several years in London waiting out the Revolutionary War. Now, I was not able to dig up that many documents on these particular brothers. They're a fairly obscure list of characters, and I can't tell you what their exact thinking was. I cannot tell you why they would not have stayed and fight. I will tell you, it's very hard to turn your back on your family and say, no, Dad, I choose never to see you again. I'm going to go die fighting against what you believe. I know it's easy to be a teenager and say, screw you, Mom. Like, it's a little harder to go to war against your family. So they do go to London. They're there for several years. Then they start to return and participate in the American founding, because it does seem that they primarily sided with the Patriots. They understood the complaints. They had friends who fought literally friends who went to fight in the war, and they maintained these friends. Now, after the war is over, John Joy Jr., the oldest Joy boy, ends up getting on a ship, coming back to Massachusetts, and essentially reviving. He wants to revive the family name. He is an apothecary, which is more or less what we would consider a pharmacist today. He has a very successful business. He gets a big house in Boston. Mostly keeps to himself, but I do include him in this discussion because there's a major, what I believe is still a major avenue in Boston, Massachusetts, called Joy Street. And while you may think that it's just Happy Street or Fun Times Thumbs Up Street, when they say Joy, no, it's actually named after the family Joy. Specifically, John Joy Jr. is the one who that street is named after. Now, his other brother, Benjamin, gets real interesting and becomes a founder, though, as you see next to me, they almost help. These next 2 founders almost help. Benjamin Joy He also returns to Massachusetts. Now, he really wants to revive the family business. His father had been a successful merchant trading around the world, and Benjamin is able to do this. He does revive the family business to a degree. On several occasions, he actually travels to India, which I alluded to before. He travels all the way to India to get Indian spices, to trade with India. I mean, trade with India had always been gigantic. A side note, China had always been trading with India, and the Americans had to, Europeans had to trade over water. There's a strong argument to be made that the reason Christopher Columbus sailed west to try and get to China or to get to India to trade there in the Indian Ocean was because just 15 years before that, the Portuguese had learned, hey, did you know, we figured it out. You can sail around the bottom of Africa. The Atlantic and Indian Oceans actually meet. Guys, look at this. They meet. So, and that opened up trade with the Indian Ocean, and India being right in the middle of China, it was a boom to world trade. And, you know, as I said, the tea that they were protesting against was coming from China well before this. So trade with India seemed essential to establishing a world empire, even at a time where the states consider themselves separate states. But he goes to and from India a few times, and Benjamin Joy ends up living in India, in what was then called Calcutta, when George Washington needs a representative in India. This is after the Constitution, after Washington becomes president, and he appoints Benjamin Joy as the first American consul in Calcutta. Essentially the person who establishes diplomatic relations with India. Now, at the time, India was run by a corporation called the East India Tea Company. The East India Company was a corporation that had a monopoly on everything. They were essentially, the corporation was the government. So you weren't really dealing with Great Britain. You were dealing with the East India Tea Company that more or less ran most of India. Now, India, I will note, was kind of broken off into chunks and different colonies. Some were owned by France and Portugal and Spain and things like that. But at this point, Benjamin Joy is the one appointed by George Washington to open up that relationship with India. Unfortunately, the East India Company does not recognize Benjamin Joy as a consul. So, frustrated, he leaves and goes back to the United States as about a year later. But Benjamin Joy is credited with opening up relations with India, though they did not open the door very wide at all. And finally, George Joy. Now, George Joy is the one I stumbled onto. George Joy remains in London for his whole life. Now, he keeps up a correspondence because his father's very wealthy. He has friends in high places, as they say. And he keeps up a correspondence with all sorts of people. That being said, he seems to see himself as more important to diplomatic negotiations than anyone else. He's essentially a self-appointed ambassador from the United States to Great Britain. Granted, he skipped the Revolutionary War, and by the 25 years later, he doesn't really have that much say in what's going on in either country. That being said, he corresponds with Jefferson and Madison as Jefferson becomes president. Apparently, he talks to Madison one time. Madison responds once, and then gets more letters, and then stops responding until well after his presidency begins. He stops responding at all for 15 years, because this George Joy guy, he doesn't have... Everyone slowly realizes that although he's telling Britain he has very strong connections in America, and he's telling America he has very strong connections in Britain, people slowly realize he doesn't. No one takes this guy seriously. So, unfortunately for Joy, he does his best to resolve issues that lead to the War of 1812, specifically impressment. He really tries to get Britain to stop impressing American soldiers, and he tries to stop Americans from embargoing Britain. Now, he doesn't successfully do any of this, but to his credit, he does try. Again, the reason is he thinks he's more valuable than anyone else thinks he is. That's why it's not successful. So, again, that's George Joy, one of the Joy brothers. I think his story is hilarious. Though, again, he did his best to resolve all these issues, but no, didn't work. So the Joy brothers really tried to help on international diplomatic scale and didn't. Just didn't. So that's the Joy family, the Joy brothers. Originally from Massachusetts, but their loyalist daddy made them move. So let's conclude with Daniel D. Tompkins, the Vice President of Good Feelings. Or so you were told. I'm going to take a sip of my water real quick. So Daniel D. Tompkins is one of these guys who just has a monster brain, who's extraordinarily smart and succeeds mostly on his own volition. It's not to say he didn't come from a fairly wealthy family. He came from a moderately wealthy family in New York. That being said, he's just 30 years old. He is both elected to the House of Representatives and the New York State Supreme Court. He ends up resigning immediately his position in the House of Representatives. He never takes his seat there because at the time, working for the state Supreme Court was a more valuable position than in many aspects than working in the House of Representatives. 3 years later, he's just 33 years old, Tompkins is elected as governor of New York State. Now, he stays as governor of New York State for a decade. During this time, the War of 1812 breaks out, and he, as commander-in-chief of the state militia, and I'll remind you, New York State is often overlooked. The War of 1812, a lot of the battles of War of 1812 take place in New York State and on the border of New York State and Canada, in Lake Ontario and in the St. Lawrence River. So New York is an extraordinarily important hotspot, crossroads of the War of 1812. And as governor of New York State, he was commander-in-chief of the state militia, which was extraordinarily important to winning the war. Now, it was hard to pay for this war. James Madison's government didn't send all the money the state militia needed, so Daniel D. Tompkins is one of several people who pays for the war out of his own pocket. He would later in life essentially go bankrupt paying for the War of 1812. One of several people to do so. During this time, you have revolutionary luminaries like Rufus King, who was one of the last Federalists who would later run for President of the United States himself, tries to run against Daniel Tompkins and loses to this young man who holds on for a decade as governor of New York, and Stephen Van Rensselaer, who, when adjusted for inflation, is the 10th wealthiest American of all time. He was from Rensselaerwyck, which was essentially Rensselaer Manor, the holdover from Dutch feudal New York society, as I like to talk about so much. He then, after the war ends, Tompkins becomes a national hero because not only does he lead New York in so many battles, he doesn't actually lead in the battles, but he is overseeing so many battles of the War of 1812, which is largely won in New York, despite neighboring New England being really against the war. Also because he put so much of his own money into winning the war. He becomes a national hero. Now, this is also important because he's from New York. New York was a swing state for the majority of the American founding. Half was Federalist, half was Republican. Federalist New England had a lot of power with a lot of people's minds in New York, and Democratic Republican South had a lot of sway there, as well as New Jersey was in a similar situation. But New York was not only one of the most powerful, wealthy states, but it was quickly growing into the largest city. It was like New York City was, I think, the third largest city in the colonies leading up to the Revolutionary War, maybe even fourth after Charleston. And here we are in the Madison administration, and it's now the largest, and gaining. Hamilton did a lot to make that happen. This continues going on. I see your question. I'll answer in just a second. Anyway, Tompkins is paying all this. Lost my train of thought. Tompkins becomes a hero. Oh, so New York is a swing state, and that's why you see a lot of vice presidents being from New York. Famously, there's the Virginia dynasty: Washington, Skip Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe. They are all from the Virginia. They are called the Virginia dynasty. All these early presidents are from Virginia, but to get those people elected, they needed a vice presidential candidate from a swing state. Imagine that. Some things never change, and that the biggest swing state was New York. That's why Aaron Burr ran as Jefferson's vice president, and then when Burr didn't work out, after that was longtime governor of New York, George Clinton, runs for vice president. And then you have Daniel D. Tompkins, and then after him, side note, Martin Van Buren ends up being the vice president. So four of Four of the first 5 presidents are from Virginia. 4 of the first 8 vice presidents are from New York. For political reasons, mostly. The third of which is Daniel D. Tompkins. So Daniel D. Tompkins, as I said, he made himself a hero because of his work as governor of New York during the War of 1812. And therefore, when James Monroe is running for president and needs a New Yorker, who's the best candidate? Well, Daniel D. Tompkins had always been siding with the Democratic Republicans for most of his career. So he is brought in as the vice presidential candidate for James Monroe, and he wins. And we give a lot of credit to George Washington for winning unanimously in his first election. James Monroe runs unopposed. There is a token candidate put up by the Federalists, escapes me. That one might have been actually Rufus King, but James Monroe runs unopposed. That's why it's called the era of good feelings. We won the Second American Revolution, which some people called the War of 1812, and we were free. We were a nation. We stood up for ourselves. We have now a Virginian president again. We have a New York governor. All the New Englanders, the Federalists who were considering seceding from the Union, or at least they were being accused of attempting to secede from the Union, they have been stopped. We are one nation now. James Monroe doing his tour through New England, just like George Washington did, to unite the country. Good feelings. And Daniel D. Tompkins is vice president of good feelings. Now, as I mentioned, he had lost most of his money in the spending on the War of 1812. He also is really super bored because being vice president seems to be a very boring position, especially back then during the era of good feelings where not a lot of decisions were being made. Now, this is right at the beginning. He would oversee the Senate when they do the Missouri Compromise, which famously ends up not resolving this issue of slavery for 40 years. But he just doesn't care for working at the federal level. He doesn't care for being vice president. So he actually goes and runs for governor of New York again. And this time, unfortunately for him, he loses. So he goes to his fallback job, which is vice president of the United States of America. That's his fallback plan. Now, Tompkins, unfortunately, between losing all his money, not liking his current job, and losing the race for governor of New York, which he had had for a decade, that was his job. I thought the people of New York loved me. He ends up being very sad, and he ends up turning to the bottle and becoming an alcoholic. Now, there are a bunch of interesting facts that stem from Daniel D. Tompkins' presidency. He serves through all 8 years of James Monroe's presidency, and he is the only vice president in the 1800s, the whole of the 19th century. He's the only person to serve for 2 full terms as vice president. Everyone else either only ran once or was replaced, blah, blah. Additionally, he is the second vice president from New York in like 15 years to be vice president while running for governor of New York. Aaron Burr had done exactly the same thing in 1804, just 12 years earlier. The difference is Aaron Burr was being replaced by Thomas Jefferson on the ticket. Now that the rules had changed, they made that the 12th Amendment to change the rules of presidency. So now you run on a ticket. And after Burr really trying to be president for a minute there, Thomas Jefferson did not want Aaron Burr to come back. So he replaced him with former governor of New York, George Clinton. So Aaron Burr says, well, in that case, I'm going to run for governor of New York. And it's that campaign that leads to the duel with Hamilton. But I bring it up because you have a vice president from New York running for governor of New York instead of running for vice president again. And then 12 years later, you have another vice president of the United States from New York running for governor of New York. That's a really funny little thing there. Now, what's not really funny is, as I said, Daniel D. Tompkins did become an alcoholic, and he actually dies from his consumption of alcohol just 99 days after leaving the office of vice presidency. Now, that's a very short time to start drinking, become an alcoholic, and die. Probably, Daniel D. Tompkins had been suffering from alcoholism for a substantial portion of his vice presidency. He's also the very last founder. I'm sorry, he's the last. He is the vice president whose post-vice presidential career is the shortest. Again, as I said, that 99 days after his vice presidency, he passes away. Every vice president who lived through his vice presidency, has served more than 99 days. So he has the shortest post vice presidential career out of any vice president. So not all the happiest stories for Daniel D. Tompkins, but certainly a fascinating one. Certainly an unbelievably interesting and important American founder who's often overlooked. Again, VP of Good Feelings is how it starts. Doesn't necessarily end that way. And that's pretty much it for today. But I do see some questions coming in. Who is Aaron Salisbury? He is right here in the ground in Derby. Where is Derby? I've not heard of Aaron Salisbury. When I think of Salisbury, I think of the guy who debates Hamilton. In the thing. No. I will have to look into Aaron Salisbury. You got some other names here. Smash that like button. Yeah, thanks guys. If you want to hit like, that's amazing. Captain John Fanning on the headstone. It says John J. Martin. Just curious. Yeah, no problem. Thank you for coming, TJ. New York, huh? Where in New York is Derby? I've lived in New York my whole life. I'm not sure where Derby is. I figure if anyone knows, it's you. You know, I can look into some of these guys though. John Fanning. Yeah, it'll take me a minute. I'm not gonna. Ooh, excuse me. The founder and CEO of Napster, John Fanning. Oh, you're out. Oh, okay, so you're out by Jamestown. You're like further past Buffalo by like Ellicottville. Is that your local beer? Let's see. And then John J. Martin. I don't know. So what's interesting about New York State, especially our western parts of New York State, is that a lot of it is New Englanders. So after the war, like I live outside Syracuse. This is the many of the different states paid their soldiers the only way they could by giving them land. Those soldiers usually sold that land for money because they didn't want to move out to the woods. I live in the central New York military tract, which is one of those areas. And this was very quickly negotiated away from the Native Americans and then settled by New Englanders, actually, more than people from downstate New York. New Englanders came out here, and then eventually as land purchases went on, moved further out to your area. So I am not surprised. It's fun being in New York because almost every town around here was founded by a former soldier, a veteran of the American Revolution, who literally just went in the woods and usually built some kind of mill, found a river and built a mill. And that's the history of upstate New York in a nutshell. Yeah, I will have to look into those. That's cool. I'll definitely look into Derby history for you a little bit, Tyler. That's a lot of fun. We did run over a little bit. I'm actually surprised. Hour 15 minutes, but there were a lot of fun stories this week. I should note I have made changes recently, which something about the War of 1812. So my area was settled in the 1790s. A lot of the towns out here were settled under the Washington administration, and then within an hour west of me, out getting closer to Rochester, were settled in the Jefferson administration. And then even further out by Buffalo, that's generally being settled by the Madison administration, because that's just how slowly people traveled out there. It's not to say that's a general rule. That's not to say every town falls under that those specific guidelines. The War of 1812, though, as I was saying, a lot of it takes place in New York, and there's naval battles. When you look at them on a map, it's hard to tell that the Great Lakes are so big. They shouldn't be called lakes. They should be called seas. I'm under the impression they're called lakes because they're fresh water. But they are seas. They are monstrous. Like if you look at a globe, look at them, and then look at some of the other seas around the world. So there are legitimate naval battles there and at many of the coasts. Oswego, Fort Oswego by me, all the way around. By the War of 1812 too, people are already settling Ohio. Like Cleveland's already been established by Moses Cleveland and his team of Connecticuters who thought parts of Ohio belonged to them. other parts of the, Fort Detroit is already there, though that is held by, I believe, held by the British at the time, but that was established by the French years earlier. So the War of 1812 is really fascinating because a lot of it's mostly a naval war, but it's on the Great Lakes, which you don't usually, I don't know about you, I don't usually associate lakes with naval war because lake implies small. But they are monstrous bodies of water. So I'll look into those guys for you. I'll do a little discussion at some point this week on Western New York. Absolutely, it's a lot of fun. It was the frontier at the time. And parts of Western New York, even I believe, could be considered what they call the Ohio Valley region, which parts of Western Pennsylvania, like Pittsburgh, was part of the Ohio Valley. A lot of arguments over who owned what and where, things of that nature. Yeah, water historically, all societies have started around water of some nature for a variety of reasons. More modern history absolutely has been trade and moving supplies to be able to build houses and things of that nature. But rivers have been huge for first of all, agriculture. They're more predictable and you can irrigate better with them. But then for power. And that's why, like my town, I've never been to Derby. I would guess the first thing built in Derby was probably a sawmill so that they could build other houses and use the power of what you call 18 Mile Creek. I live on 9 Mile Creek. There are a lot of mile creeks. Not very clever with naming, but using the power of water to build these mills, first of all, to build sawmills, to cut things down, then to develop into grist mills, so any grains that the farmers grew could be cut in that way. In fact, the guy's name escapes me. I feel like an idiot. Erie Canal. The guy who really was promoting the Erie Canal at first was a grist mill owner, and throughout most of world history, most people were farmers. Well, come on. Oh, because I can't spell Erie right. Most humans were farmers. Even during the Revolutionary War, 85-90% of the people in the American founding were farmers. So when someone built a grist mill, that was a great place to start a farm by, because then your products could be gristed up and sent out to the world. And it was one of the reasons Jesse Hawley was a grist mill owner in central New York who realized, hey, we need to ship grain. And you know what? I should probably get rid of. We need to ship grain. What are we doing here? It would be a lot easier if we made a canal to connect all these rivers in New York. While that seemed crazy to a lot of people at first, it ends up being extraordinarily important, because suddenly now you can sail a ship from New York City up through New York, down through the Great Lakes, around to down the Mississippi. Like eventually they would work that out, but it made the Erie Canal the first superhighway. It was an extraordinary achievement that everyone criticized at first. They called it Clinton's Ditch or Clinton's Folly, after DeWitt Clinton, the governor of New York, who oversaw the installation of this. But there are many major founders. Gouverneur Morris, who helped write the Constitution, the Livingston family, there's a guy, Amos Eaton, Nathaniel Prime, big founders really, really wanted to build this canal. And it was like weird. It's one of those weird moments in history where it's like bipartisan, either for and against. Because some people were like, what do you mean you're going to dig a hole across New York State? What are you talking about? And other people were like, no, they've built some canals in Europe. We can build a canal. And actually, it's interesting because George Washington had a canal company trying to connect canals from like the Ohio Valley region, the Canassa, I believe it was the Canassa River, I think is how it's said. The Canassa River, they were trying to connect to the James River, because whoever won the race to the Ohio Valley would be able to ship all of these products to the ocean and be able to make a ton of money. And arguably, it's the Erie Canal that makes New York City. It was already growing at the time. Hamilton had already started a stock market and a bunch of banks in New York City to take advantage of that situation. But it's arguably the Erie Canal that makes New York City such an important trade hub for the entire world. Like, for a long time, America was feeding a huge portion of the world and supplying them with all sorts of things. But had George Washington won that race, although I will note George Washington had passed away years before any of these canals were completed, but had the canal society or company that Washington helped start actually won that race, could have been a huge deal. I will note that it's like the James River Company is what it's generally known as. It was first the Kanawasa and James River Company. They end up moving over to trains about that time, so that company ends up being okay. Right after they finish the Erie Canal, that's when they start building trains, and that's when we get away from the American founding. So we're not going to get too deep into that, but it is fun to know about. So, if you guys have any other questions, that's great. You can always feel free. I have all my links in the description for like Twitter, Facebook. Reach out to me there. I'm at this point a little bit easier to reach on Twitter. Though Instagram I have too. Trying to be as active as I can over there, though. Spend a lot of time making videos and writing articles. I'm always open for questions, suggestions. Thank you so much. Big shout out to the patrons that support me over on Patreon, and anyone who volunteers any donations through the PayPal account, helping me offset some of the expenses of all of this. I'm actually hoping to get a new computer pretty soon so that it doesn't yell at me the whole time. Luckily, you guys can't really hear it, but this thing's yelling at me this whole time because I put a lot of stress on it. Thank you again. Thank you, TJ, and everyone watching. I will be back. I'm going to go make some videos for the week, doing founders every day of the week. I did somehow, between leaving town this morning, forgot to get a founder out today, so I do desperately apologize to you for that. But tomorrow we're going to continue, tomorrow night, continuing our discussion on the delegates to the Continental Congress, First Continental Congress. I believe we are moving on to Maryland, so that'll be a lot of fun. So thank you guys again. I will be back with another founder and all sorts of stuff all the time, and I will leave you with that property Washington owned in the Ohio Valley, Round Bottom.